I don't watch a lot of TV unless there's a ball bouncing, and then I watch a lot of those. But it's not unusual for me to be in the other room doing something, I'm sure it's productive, and walk in, and my wife is watching one of her shows. And so I come in, and of course it's halfway through the show that is a series that has like 15 shows, and I start asking questions about what's happening. Normally she's very gracious, but I realize as I step into that moment, I don't know who the characters are, and she will say something like, well, you know, he's married to her, and I'm like, I don't know, who are these people? I don't know, because I haven't watched the whole series. And some of you binge watch TV. You know, you'll find a series that you like, and then you just go underground for a while and you watch the whole thing through, which is great. Some of those series, though, can be a little bit frustrating because you can start watching one, then you take a break and you come back, and you totally lose the place of where it was. And so this morning, we're not going to do this every week, but we're in a series where we're going through the Bible to look at what is the big picture of what God is doing, asking that simple question, what on earth is God doing, and then finding our place in it. And so we're going to do some review. We won't go into deep review every week, but just kind of want to catch you up, make sure we know where we're at. We're finishing out a section that I've called Act 1, the setting, this week. And so we're going to get up through Genesis chapter 11. Somebody asked me this last week, Wayne, you're going to go through the entire book, and we've made it through 2 chapters of Genesis. So how long is this going to actually take? Well, it's going to accelerate a little bit as we move through and past these historical books. But I do want to catch us a little bit of what we've learned at this point. And by the way, I have been sick this past week, so if I cough, I'll try to shield it. But show me some grace. But we want to do a little bit of review, and let me just give you a few shots on the screen that might help us. And we started the very first week just setting the scene. And the scene is the creation that God has created. That's the stage that all of this is occurring. And then the first week we met a few characters. We met the Creator God. And we saw how through Genesis chapter 1 it shows that He created everything that exists. And that was very much in contradiction to the Mesopotamian gods and the Egyptian gods, that they would have been their common, I guess you could say, cultural reference, that all had a different creation or a different creator, a different God that created the different parts or were created by the different parts of creation, where this is basically saying, no, there is one Creator God who created all things. And because of that, He has a right to rule. He is sovereign. The interesting next part of it is that we have mankind that's put into the garden. And we see the creation of man. We went over that a little bit. And the two things we talked about in the creation of man were two components of that image that he has. And one is that he was to have a relationship with God. And secondly, he was to reign for God. So there was an identity and there was a purpose, both wrapped up into this concept of image. In fact, we defined the purpose that man was placed here for were those two things: to live in a relationship with God and each other as He created both male and female, and to rule the earth for God. And so we saw the ruling mandate that was given in that chapter. Problem is, somebody else came into the scene. We have a third character that you're probably familiar with. We have the snake that comes into the scene, and we learn from the book of Revelation that is called the serpent of old. And he is called Satan, the great deceiver. He's the antagonist to the story. And he's also, in this particular text, as he is throughout Scripture, he is the tempter. He wants to tempt us away from our relationship with God and tempt us away from the rulership of God. And so we saw last week how he does that. And he starts with the temptation. And the first part of the temptation was to question what God said, to question God's word. Did God really say? Now, I know that you never hear that in our world today. You never hear people saying that same type thing. Okay, yeah, no, we know that is still Satan's first point of attack. Going to question God. Is that really what God said? Question His word. And then he tempts them to chase after, if you remember my fishing lures, shiny, tasty, and self-exalting things. Those are things that would draw us away from God and pursue ourselves, pursue our own way, independent of both our relationship with God and His sovereignty in our lives. What happened as a result of that temptation, them falling to it? We saw shame and blame. They hid from each other and they hid from God. And then I love that scene that Adam immediately blames his wife, who blames the serpent. We got this blame going on, and this has continued. When people walk in rebellion or against God, what you oftentimes see is these two things begin to work out in their life: shame and blame. And then there is what God then pronounces upon them, and one is that there would be suffering. You're still going to be responsible for tending this garden, and you're going to be responsible for multiplying, but those things are going to now be toil. They're going to be difficult. They're going to be suffering. There's also separation. They were removed from the garden and from that intimate walk they had with the Lord in the garden at that time. And then finally, as he promised, if you eat of this fruit, you will surely die. And at the end of chapter 3, we say where he says, you shall now return to the dust from which you came. And we're all happy that we're here on this Sunday morning. But now, the question is, what's going to happen? What next in the story? And we ask these questions. Well, how God's going to establish his reign now through man? If man was his regent that was supposed to reign, now what? What's going to happen to mankind themselves? Who's the seed we read about in Genesis chapter 3 that says that there's going to be one that's going to come? He'll be bruised by Satan, but yet he will crush Satan's head. Who is this? When's that going to come in? And so we begin to follow the story, and that's where we're going to pick up this morning. We're going to cover chapters 4 through 11. So get your seatbelt on, and we're just going to walk through this, and I'm going to at the end come back and say, so what? What does this have to do with us? How do we apply it? We'll see that probably as we track through this as well. And I did bring my glasses because I'm getting old. Oh, wow, big print. Picking up in chapter 4, and so many of these stories, they're familiar to us, and yet there's little pieces of them that you just kind of sometimes look at them and go, wow. I mean, every time I read the scriptures, I've been studying the scriptures for really all my life. I grew up in the church. I've got several theology degrees, and yet every time I go back and read something, I'm like, wow, I didn't think about that before. I didn't see that. There's a nuance to it. And so as we go through this, we're going to be looking again at some high-level things, but I want to point out a few pieces. And the first thing we have is we have the story of Cain and Abel. So Adam and Eve had children, and they had Cain and Abel. And most of us know the story of Cain and Abel. They are bringing a sacrifice before the Lord, and in that it says that Abel was the keeper of the sheep, Cain was a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Now, this idea of offering is the word mincha in the Hebrew, and some people try to figure out when they read this, what was it about Cain's offering that was not acceptable and was acceptable for Abel's offering? And some people will say because it wasn't a blood offering. There's no context to tell us that would be what they were upset with. And in fact, the mincha here is actually the same term that is used in the book of Deuteronomy for giving a grain offering. So it doesn't seem like it was the type of offering, but it could well have been the heart of the man giving the offering, and that's what this text seems to drive towards, because he goes on and he says, that time Cain brought an offering to the Lord, and this idea of an offering, this mincha, is something that an inferior gives to a superior, gave it out of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Now, I think what is going on here is that Abel didn't just give an offering. He called out a group and he said, this is the best. These are the firstlings, the best that I have. And that's what he brought to the Lord. The fat would have been a delicacy for them. It would have been something that they would have enjoyed. And so he brought those things thoughtfully to the Lord, where Cain just brought an offering. And when it says the next words that God took pleasure in Abel and his offering and did not Cain in his offering, I want to suggest to you it was the heart of the man that was being dealt with, not solely the external offering. And so in this moment, Cain gets jealous, as siblings will do. And so he gets jealous of Abel. They end up out in the field. As you know the story, Cain kills his brother Abel, which, by the way, if you look in this text, you're going to see the word brother, brother, brother used 13 times. There's an emphasis here on this was murder, but it wasn't just that. It was the violation of the family. In fact, as we go through this text, we're going to be looking at three things this morning. We're going to look at the family, we're going to look at the flood, and we're going to look at the tower. Three moments in these chapters where we look at the family, we look at the flood, and we look at the tower. And we start with the family. And so in this particular moment, we have this murder that occurs. And so God deals with him. It's really important in one part. I think it's interesting that he says here in verse 6. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door." And then this little phrase, "Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." Track that word rule and reign throughout the book of Genesis. Here was a man placed in the garden, mankind, with the commission to rule, but now they're submitting themselves to not ruling over sin, to not ruling over this earth, but to be ruled by another. And so this whole story continues to unwrap how mankind, given this commission, given this relationship, actually spirals away from it. And continues in the spiral after these two young men. We have Lamech, who comes in verse 19. And Lamech is the first one that we know that had, polygamy. We don't know if there were others, but it says Lamech took 2 wives. And then he sings a song of pride to his wives. And, this is Valentine's, right? How would you like this song sung to you at Valentine's by your husband? "Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. The wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's vengeance is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. What we have now is someone not only rebelling against God and harming his fellow man, but taking pride in it, exalting themselves, thinking even others should praise them for it. And I think there's a danger here when people celebrate what God prohibits. When people celebrate what God prohibits, you can be sure that danger is ahead. And I think about that in our life, in our culture. We used to talk to our kids about, hey, here's a circle of blessing. Live within the circle of blessing. And that circle of blessing are the directives that God has given for our lives. And when you step out of that, you step into the danger zone. And it's the same thing here. God has given us instruction, and we live in relationship to Him. We live under His sovereign lordship. Then we live in the circle of blessing. We step outside of it, and we are in that area of great danger. That is true of us. Is true of any group of people that come together. But there's an interesting statement that this chapter is primarily on this downward spiral, but then in verse 26 it says, at that time, well, let me step back one verse. To Seth also was born a son. So this would have been Seth. That was kind of the replacement for Abel. He called his name Enosh, and at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So we're going to see throughout this chapter throughout these chapters that we go through, that wickedness continues to just explode. But within that, there's a group of people who continue to call upon the name of the Lord. God is going to work His purposes out through His people, even when it looks like it's the darkest hour. So as he walks through this, we move to chapter 5. And here's a list, of Adam's descendants. There's this term here that says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. I told you last time there's these markers in Genesis talking about the generations of Adam, the generations of the earth, the generations will keep doing that, generations of Abraham. You'll hear that over and over again. It's just following the line that is being born as people come out of these lines. The word is toledot there, not that you care, but there it is. And it says that he named them man and woman. Just kind of going back over this, but what stands out in this chapter, look at the end of verse 5, and it says, and thus all the days of Adam were 930 years, and he died. Verse 6, Seth lived 912 years, and he died. Enosh lived 905 years, and he died. Kenan lived 910 years, and he died. See a repetitive thing here? Don't get hung up in the 910 years. I'll explain that in my going deeper segments, but it's all ending in that everybody does exactly what God said would happen in Genesis chapter 1, and that is, if you eat of this fruit, most surely you will die. And whenever you're reading the scriptures and you're going through one of these genealogies, and then there's something that is either repetitive in the genealogies, or if there's something that's different, all of a sudden there's a statement that is made. Take note of that statement, and this one is in verse 21. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. It's one of the only couple of statements in the scriptures where it appears as though he did not suffer physical death, but God took him into his presence. And it says it's because he was one who called upon the name of the Lord and walked with God. In the midst of a sliding moral temperature, he walked with God. You see a theme? When there's wickedness, when times are difficult, when you don't see what God is doing, walk with God. Walk with Him. So, Methuselah lived a long time, and he died. This is such a happy verse. But then something interesting happens. At the end of verse 5, Lamech, who is another one of the descendants, had lived 182 years. He fathered a son and called his name Noah. And he says this about Noah. Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. I find it incredibly interesting that this little verse is saying something about what has been passed on from those who walked with God and their hope. This is going all the way back to the Genesis account when God said, one day there will be a seed of woman who will deliver you from Satan. It will crush his head. And so this is beginning to be the unfolding and the looking, the anticipation that this toil, this struggle, this separation from God is going to have resolution. Somebody's going to bring resolution to it. Now, what we're going to see in this story and many others is there's others that seem to rise up. Maybe it's that one. No. I mean, we're going to read Noah here. Noah's a pretty incredible guy. But Noah had his faults. And we're going to see a big one that comes into his life. So as we move into chapter 6, we get this fun chapter 6 of the flood story. Now, here's where we could spend a whole week talking about various pieces of this. In fact, you look at chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, and you have some interesting things you have to come to grips with. One is, who are the sons of God? Let me just read this for you, and then I'm going to make a couple of comments, and then we'll move past it. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took them as their wives, any that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years, so he's limiting the lifespan. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. They were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Now, as this text goes on, we're going to read more and more, but these two ideas of who are the sons of God and who are the Nephilim. The only other time the sons of God is used is in the book of Job. And yet the sons of God has a number of possible interpretations. One of them is that they were angelic beings, fallen angels, that would align a little bit with the understanding of Job, who had relationships with the women of mankind and produced this super race called the Nephilim. Now, the only real problem with that interpretation is Jesus says that angels are neither given nor taken in marriage. And there seems to be this line that's drawn that they can't do that. Now, there could be the fact that they were demonic possessed people who were possessed by those angelic beings who had these relationships. It could also be that the sons of God is a very common term that is used for kings during the Mesopotamian area. They were always considered that they were the sons of God. Therefore, they were mighty on the earth. And some people believe that they could be talking about that group of people. And then you have the Nephilim. And we don't know who the Nephilim are. They're like Shaquille O'Neal on steroids. They were obviously these humans that were huge, or some human form. And I want to tell you the same thing that one of my friends, who's a seminary prof for years at Dallas Theological Seminary, he was teaching through this, and he said, I want to take 3 seconds, and I want to tell you how important it is for you to know who the sons of God are and the Nephilim. Let's go. Okay. That's really how important it is for you to know that in your daily existence. It is a curiosity. It is something to try, that's worth studying and having fun with, but to be honest, it's probably not going to change your life if you figure that out. So don't get torqued out if you can't figure out exactly what's going on in this moment with those words. But we just realized that the emphasis is that there was a continued moral decay among these that God had created to be in relationship with Him and to rule for Him. So much so that in verse 8 it says, and the Lord God regretted that He had made man on earth, and it grieved Him in His heart. And so He said, I'm going to blot him out from the face of the earth. But then it says, except for Noah. Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. And so again, there was one who is going to tell us again that he walked with God. Verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. And here's the emphasis. Noah walked with God. If you could use the Hebrew, oftentimes that last phrase is the point. It's the main thing. In other words, those who walk with God will live blameless. That's the way when we get to the law. It's going to say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then any of the other commands, that'll work out of that. Because if you have your right relationship with the Lord and you love Him, these other things will be true of your life. And so here, God is going to destroy those that He has created, and He's going to do it with a flood. Remember that walking with God still delivers from wickedness. And even in this moment, that's walking from God is going to be part of what God uses to identify Noah and then deliver him. And then in this text, we have what is called in verse 18, I will establish my covenant. So God says, I'm going to destroy the earth, I'm going to save Noah and his family, and I'm going to make a covenant with them. First time this idea of covenant comes up in the Scriptures, and in each major act in the Bible, we're going to see at least one covenant that helps define that time period, and that is true of this covenant of Noah. And you know the Noah story, which, by the way, always fascinates me how we use the story of Noah for kids stuff. I was looking at, we had a nursery when our kids first came home, and we had adopted them, and they come home, and there around the trim was the scenes of Noah's Ark. And I just wanted to say, yes, kids, this is God's judgment. This is really a time of judgment, and yet we want to give them the toys to play with. I'm sorry, I'm dark. It's like you'll understand my kids as you get to know them a little bit. But, in that moment, that this isn't a happy story as this goes through. It's a story of defeat. It's a story of God's judgment. And yet, in the middle of His judgment, it's also a story of God's incredible grace by saving this one family. And it says down at the end of that chapter that there were floodwaters over the whole heavens, and that it was deep. And look, there's a big debate. Was this a localized flood, or was it a worldwide flood? Because of that verse, I tend to think it was a worldwide flood, but my faith doesn't rest upon that. If it is proven that it was a localized flood, it would have still killed all the humankind that had been created, and so maybe they were still in a localized area. But the reading of the text to me seems to indicate, and I would say that there's even science that indicates that it was probably a worldwide flood, which also strikes you interesting. If you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, you'll remember me talking when we went through that about the possibility that it says that God created the heavens and the earth, and yet the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. What was the state at that point? It was the whole earth covered in water. So again, there's this judgment at this point where the whole earth is covered by water. But God preserves mankind. And then the story, He sends the bird out, and the bird comes back, and eventually he has an olive branch in his mouth. So he figures that, okay, there's dry land. So they park the boat. Actually, I don't think they steered the thing at all. I think it just landed right on Mount Ararat. And then eventually they all are released. And it's a great story. It's excitement. It's all this that's going on. And yet we need to remember a couple of interesting facts. And that is, this flood story is a story of judgment. And when I was thinking about the New Testament, I was like, okay, where in the New Testament is the flood story talked about? Well, let me give you a couple. One is in Matthew chapter 24. If I can find Matthew, it's in the New Testament. Did anybody see that? I was in Ezekiel. I'm like, what? Where is it? All right. We're getting there. And so Matthew chapter 24 is an interesting passage. It's a very, we may spend some time on there eventually because it's a story of the end times. It's when Jesus is actually going to come back. And so it's a story there of some of the judgment that is actually going to take place. And then let me get the right verse here, in verse 37. All right. In verse 37, we read these words. I'll go back 1 hour in verse 36. But concerning the day and the hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. So that's, when is Christ coming back? When is this going to happen? When is he going to set up his kingdom? Well, only the Father knows. For as the days of Noah, so will be the coming of man. For as those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. They were all unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So it will be with the coming of the Son of Man. And so I always want to say, when is the day of repentance? It's today. Because we don't know the timing of God. And we don't know when this judgment, when Christ will come back and reward those who are his, and yet also judge those who have rejected. And this story is a story of both salvation and judgment. And so we go through the flood story, and we come out on the other side of the flood. And a couple of passages dear to me. One of them is verse 3 of chapter 9. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. They were no longer vegetarians. They can now have brisket. So that's a very important passage that I learned early on in my life. And he said also, I gave you the green plants. If you want some of that, you can have that too. I give you everything. And so this is, as they come out, it says that Noah built an altar. He worshiped the Lord. And yet, coming off of that, God gave them some additional commands. One of them was that of capital punishment. Now, why is this important? He says in verse 8, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God has made man in his own image. And here's what he's emphasizing again. Mankind has been made in my image for a relationship with me and to fulfill my purposes on this earth. Therefore, if you kill one of these human beings, you have killed one in my image. And that's why sanctity of life is so important in scriptural perspective, whether it be from conception to death. Life is honored because we are made in the image of God. That is a profound truth that we should have in the very core of our being, because it's also incredibly encouraging to know that you are created in the image of God, and God honors it to this degree. And so he establishes this covenant with him and their offspring. He's not going to destroy the world anymore. He puts the covenant rainbow in the sky. So he has first claim to what the rainbow means. And it's a reminder of what's his deliverance, and that he will not again destroy at least the earth in that way. And then we have the descendants of Noah. And I've got to really ramp through this last chapter and a half. But we're going to see the line of descendants that are Canaan is cursed because of something that happened after the flood. Now, here's what's interesting, that it says that, this one is one who called upon the name of the Lord, but what did he do after this time of worship at the altar? He went and planted a vineyard, got drunk, fell asleep in his tent naked. We're not sure exactly what happened at that point, but his youngest son apparently saw his nakedness, and I think personally this was a sign of the violation of the honor of your father and your mother, and that the way in which he handled that was not to protect his father, but it was to make fun of him and to show him to his other brothers. And so this is really a sign of that very commandment that says it will go well with you if you honor your father and your mother. This is the precursor to it. He did not do that, and there was a shame upon him at that time. His other two brothers come in with a towel or something over their shoulders, cover their father. But here's Noah. Noah, you just had the greatest deliverance and victory, and what did you do? You went and got drunk and laid in your tent in shame. And I'm just like, there we are. I mean, isn't that all of us? We'll see these great spiritual victories. We worship and then we fall. But God is still gracious. He still moves in our lives. He still covers our sin, and he brings us back to himself. In verse 10, we have the table of nations descended from Noah. And there's all these, they're being, year after year after year, they're growing. They're multiplying. And then it says that they all gathered in one place and had one language. And it says this, and the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, and it goes on with all of them. From those, the coastland of the people spread, each in his own language, by their clans and their nations. And you hear that over and over again, this idea of them multiplying by their names, their languages, and their territories. Chapter 11 says, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. They found this great new thing called a brick. And so they start, let's build something. And let's build something all the way to the heavens. Do you not want to be like God? Build something to the heavens. Make your own temple. Make your own way to heaven. And then it says, and let's do that, lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth. What was their commission? To be fruitful and multiply across the face of the earth. And so now all of a sudden they're saying, no, I'm going to reject God as the sole sovereign. I'm going to reject his word, and we're going to do it this way. And then God says, look what they're doing. So he goes down and he confuses their language and scatters them across the nation. Okay, if you will not do it because the way I've told you, then I will still make it happen, even in your rebellion. And so they don't have the same language, and they scatter, and thus we have the scattering of the nations across the world. Now, a couple things I want to just kind of end with as we wrap up, and just some points of application, some points of thought. And I'll say, this over and over again, is that when a culture rejects God's design, it's doomed for failure. But when the people of God live in the midst of a wicked culture, walking with God, there's always hope. There's always hope. Now, family flood and the tower. Let's think through those just a moment. First of all, the family. I think I have these on the screen here. Though sin stains every generation, God's unwavering purpose endures through those who walk with God by faith. Every generation has its sin. Some of us look back, we think about the golden days. Everything was beautiful and wonderful back then, until you really start thinking about it. And then you realize, you know what? It was kind of crummy then too. We had our problems. There were a different set of problems, but they were there. The reality is that as long as man has continued to go down this path, there is a sin in every generation, and it's what the scriptures call original sin, the sin nature, and every one of us are born with it. Every one of us live with it, and yet we're going to have to be rescued from it. And so in the midst of all of that, we also know that there are those who walk with God by faith in every generation throughout time. And then second, we have the flood. And on the flood, we realize that faith anchored in God's promises becomes a lifeline to salvation, and also lifeline to salvation from judgment. I don't have time to look at all these passages this morning, but let me refer to one. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. It says this about Noah. It says that he built the ark because of faith in the unseen. It is very likely there had never been a Texas thunderstorm on earth before the flood. Very likely there was some type of vapor canopy, and when it collapsed, the earth flooded. So he did not know in that sense what rain of this magnitude would have been. They didn't have boats. They didn't have a navy. And yet God's telling him to do this, and his response is, by the word of God, I will obey and I will walk in faith to what he tells me to do. And he builds the ark. How do you now escape the wickedness of this world and the judgment to come? It is by faith. It is by faith. That which is unseen, that yet you know is from God, and you place your faith in that reality. Finally, we have the tower. And I would say this about the tower. Now, on the other side of the cross, God is now bringing people of every tribe, tongue, and nation into a relationship and rule through Jesus Christ. That's the text I read early from the book of Revelation. From every tribe, tongue, and nation are those who worship him. And at the end of that text it says, and they will reign. God is about restoring things back through Christ. Now here's something really interesting I'll just put out there to you. As far as we know, the Tower of Babel is not really directly spoken about in the New Testament. Except there's one curious something that happens. After Jesus dies and is resurrected and the Spirit of God comes out upon the people of God, there's that scene in Acts chapter 2 where it says that those that were there began to speak in the tongues of known languages of that day. And it says that all the people that had gathered in Jerusalem to worship at that time heard the magnificent works of God in their own language. I think in many ways this is a moment when God was undoing what he did at Babel for only one purpose, that the kingdom of God through Jesus Christ would be proclaimed to all nations. And then, from there on, we'll see the culmination of that in the book of Revelation. God is not done, and we're going to see as we walk through our story that there are ups and downs. There are those who live by faith, but the ultimate culmination is going to come when we come to the New Testament on the other side of the cross and we see what Jesus has done. It should make us appreciate even more these stories from the Old Testament that are pointing towards something better, something greater, the salvation that is coming through Christ that God himself will bring.